Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this discussion on study design principles. As I was creating this lesson, I was thinking 5 years from now, what would I really like for you to be either able to know or to be able to do? And I think the big picture of what would be very helpful for you is to truly understand the the issue around the defining feature of the different study designs. And so here is a copy of a handout that you have in your Canvas page. Yours has little boxes around all of these, so I think it makes a little bit more sense. But the basic idea is that we have a variety of different kinds of study designs here down the left-hand side: case reports, ecologic, cross-sectional, case control, cohort, blah, blah, blah. So you have all these different kinds of study designs. And if you were to take one thing away from this, it would be this idea. Each one of these has something about it that's unique, that is the defining feature of that specific study design. It's different from the others in that particular regard, and it may not be different from all of them, but it is a defining. It's a feature that helps to um, identify that specific study design. If you were to read the description in a published report or a journal article, you'd say, oh, yeah, yeah, that's this kind of study design. Each of those defining features has its own associated advantages and limitations that are dependent on the defining feature. So we will learn specifically what some of the advantages and limitations are for cross-sectional studies, and what is the defining feature of the cross-sectional study. The advantages and limitations are intricately tied to the defining feature, the thing that makes it unique. So that's the thing that I would want you to take away from it. If you can identify the defining feature or the study design type, and you know the defining feature of that study design type, then you will know the advantages and limitations. So here we have the defining feature of a giraffe is its very long neck. Advantages: it can eat leaves from trees that are very far off the ground. But it does have limitations in that giraffe um, are very vulnerable when they're drinking water. They can be attacked by other animals, and so that is a limitation. All right, so back to our drawing board. We are going to specifically be talking about cross-sectional study design. And so with cross-sectional study design, it is exactly what it sounds like. If you were to have a loaf of bread and you were to take a slice out of it, that is what it means to be cross-sectional. It's this one little slice, and it specifically is a slice in time. Sometimes you'll see reports that are for the year 2017, blah, 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 something. We want to describe this particular thing. That's what a cross-sectional study design is. Surveys are a very common type of cross-sectional study design. And if you think about it, in a survey, we're asking all these different kinds of questions. Tell me about your demographics, your gender, your race, ethnicity, what town do you live in, tell me about your diseases or any outcomes that I might be interested in. Um, so we're collecting all of this information all at the same essentially period of time, and that deserves a little bit of an explanation. Specifically, people say, well, it wasn't at exactly the same minute. And here's how I would define cross-sectional, because you're right, there are a lot of gray areas. We have these notions, these kinds of different types of definitions of variable types. We might call them exposure and disease. If you're exposed to a certain thing, then you might come down with a specific disease. We might have predictor and outcome. We might have independent variables or dependent variables if you're talking like biostat lingo. You might also refer to these kinds of variables as x and y. So what I'd like to share then is, since we're collecting all of these pieces of information all at the same time in one cross section, here we are, we're just, time goes by, but we're just collecting it all like a slice of bread. There are some inherent advantages to that, and there are some inherent disadvantages. Now, the advantage is that in a lot of other study designs, we collect information early on, and then later we collect more information. Well, because time goes by, we could lose people along the way. In other words, we could lose track of them. They could move away. They could decide they don't want to be part of this anymore. For whatever reason, as time goes by, we might lose track of people. Also, it's very expensive to keep track of people and to keep asking them questions related to your particular research question. And so time and money is something that inherently is generally saved in cross-sectional. Now obviously you can do a ginormic cross-sectional, and that's going to take more time and money than a smaller cross-sectional. But in general, all other things kind of being equal, a cross-sectional study that is completed all in one go will generally cost you less time and money. An even bigger advantage is that if you don't have to follow people forward and they can't get lost, you're going to get all of the information. You're going to collect on all the questions that they're willing to answer. If they need to give you information and you give them a survey on Tuesday and they come in to have their blood drawn on Wednesday, you're done. You have collected everything. You can't lose track of them over the next 5 years, because it doesn't matter what happens in 5 years. They could move out of the country. You have all the information that you need. So there's what's called no loss to follow up. No loss to up. So you don't lose track of them. And so those are a couple of really big advantages. The primary disadvantage is that we can't say anything in general about whether that exposure caused that disease. And so this gets into a concept that we call causation or causality. If we collect it all at the same time over here on the left, then there was not time for that exposure to lead to that disease. And so we might be seeing an association that's not really, either it's not there or it's not causal. The other kinds of studies, so not cross-sectional, they don't measure disease at the same time as they measure exposure. They don't measure the outcome. They don't measure that dependent variable or the y. They collect the information on exposure. They wait a certain amount of time, and then they collect the disease, the outcome, the dependent, the y. And people say, well, how much time has to go by? Is it a week or a month or 20 years? The amount of time that has to pass is the amount of time for that exposure or that predictor or independent or whatever to be able to physiologically lead to that disease. So if I ask somebody, so what have you been eating for breakfast, let's say in the last week? And then do you have colon cancer? There was not enough time from them eating breakfast this week to having the disease. So that is the general idea, is that we need to have enough time gone by in order to be able to say that that exposure is causal of that disease or outcome. Clearly, if we collect that information at exactly the same time, it gets trickier and trickier to talk about causation. So here, let me show you one more way to think about that. And sometimes it's helpful to draw that. So I'm going to use E for exposure and D for disease. In a cross-sectional study, exposure and disease are measured at the same time. So if this x-axis is representing time going by, exposure and disease are measured at the same exact time, as opposed to in other more longitudinal studies, the exposure is measured at an earlier time, and then the disease is measured later. And so sometimes it's helpful to note what it's being compared to. So if the exposure and the disease, the dependent and independent variables, if they're measured at the same exact time, then that is the key feature of a cross-sectional study. It's in the name. They've named it cross-sectional so that you would know that there's this cross-section where we're measuring everything. So that is a little orientation to study design principles. I hope that you have the notion that that defining feature is really key to understanding the strengths and the limitations of that particular study design. Every study design has strengths and weaknesses, or advantages and limitations, however you want to say that. There is no perfect study design that is better than the others. It depends on your research question, the money and the time that you have to conduct that research. And so every study design has pluses and minuses. And so thinking about that defining feature will really help you understand those strengths and limitations so that you don't use that study incorrectly or the findings from it. Thank you for joining me for that topic.